It was a dark and stormy night in the small Swiss city of Zurich. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the windows of the great minster. Inside, a young priest named Huldrych Zwingli was pacing back and forth, his mind racing with ideas that could change the world. He had just received a letter from a man named Rode, who had traveled from Wittenberg to Basel and then to Zurich, carrying a controversial document. This document, written by a man named Eluin, challenged the very core of the Catholic Church's teachings on the Eucharist, the bread and wine that were believed to become the body and blood of Christ. Zwingli was no stranger to controversy. He had already begun to question many of the Church's practices, and the ideas in Eluin's letter resonated deeply with him. But he knew that embracing these ideas could be dangerous. The Church had a long history of silencing those who dared to question its authority. Yet, Zwingli couldn't ignore the truth he saw in the letter. He decided to share it with a few trusted friends, including a fellow reformer named Oecolampadius, who was based in Basel. Word of Zwingli's interest in Eluin's ideas spread quickly. In Wittenberg, a man named Martin Luther, who had already caused a stir with his own reforms, heard about it and was furious. Luther had a deep respect for the traditional teachings of the Church, especially when it came to the Eucharist. He saw Zwingli and his followers as a threat to the unity of the Protestant movement, which was still in its infancy. Luther's anger boiled over in a fierce letter he wrote in December 1524, titled, "Against the Heavenly Prophets in the Matter of Images and Sacraments." In it, he called Zwingli and his allies mad spirits, and warned that their ideas were leading people astray. The letter was a declaration of war, and it set the stage for a bitter theological battle that would divide the Protestant world. Meanwhile, in Zurich, Zwingli was not alone in his doubts. A man named Andreas Karlstadt, who had been a colleague of Luther's in Wittenberg, had also begun to question the traditional understanding of the Eucharist. Karlstadt published his own treatises in November 1524, arguing that when Christ said, "This is my body," he was not referring to the bread, but to himself. This view was similar to Zwingli's, and it only added fuel to the fire. The controversy grew, and more people began to take sides. In Strasbourg, two influential reformers, Martin Bucer and Wolfgang Capito, initially expressed some agreement with Zwingli's ideas. But as the debate intensified, they too found themselves caught in the crossfire. The conflict was not just about theology, it was about power and the future of the Protestant movement. As news of the dispute spread, it reached the ears of Philip of Hesse, a powerful German prince who had embraced the Protestant cause. Philip saw the growing rift as a threat to the unity of the evangelical movement and the safety of the territories that had adopted the new teachings. He feared that the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V would use the divisions to crush the reformers. Determined to find a solution, Philip invited the leading theologians to a meeting in Marburg in September 1529. The goal was to bridge the gap between Luther and Zwingli, but the meeting ended in failure. Despite reaching agreement on 14 major points, the two sides could not reconcile their differences over the Eucharist. Zwingli's argument that the Spirit alone gives life and the flesh is of no avail clashed with Luther's insistence that the bread and wine truly become the body and blood of Christ. As the meeting came to a close, Luther told Zwingli that he could not allow him to be his disciple. Zwingli, in turn, urged Luther to pray for enlightenment. The two men left Marburg with the gap between them wider than ever. The failure at Marburg had far-reaching consequences. It solidified the divide between the Lutherans and the Reformed. and it made it clear that the Protestant movement was not a monolithic entity, but a collection of diverse and often competing factions. The debate over the Eucharist would continue to shape the course of the Reformation for years to come, and it would have a profound impact on the political and religious landscape of Europe. But the story of the Reformation is not just about the battles between theologians. It is also about the people who lived through these tumultuous times, the farmers, the artisans, and the ordinary citizens who were caught in the crossfire. In the years to come, the ideas that Zwingli and his followers championed would spread far beyond Zurich, touching the lives of people in cities and villages across Switzerland and Germany. The seeds of dissent had been sown, and they would soon bear fruit in ways that no one could have predicted. By 1530, the Reformation had taken root in several Swiss cities and rural areas: Zurich, Bern, Basel, and Schaffhausen, along with the city of St. Gall, and many rural parishes had enacted their own versions of church reform. These new church orders were heavily influenced by Zurich's example, where Huldrych Zwingli was a leading figure. Zwingli himself helped draft Bern's new ecclesiastical ordinance, which included provisions for a Prosi, a kind of church council, and community morals courts, similar to Zurich's Ehegericht, marriage court, but called Korgerichten in Bern. In Basel, the reformer Johannes Oecolampadius pushed for a system of moral discipline based on early Christian practices. He believed that the church should have its own system of discipline jointly run by pastors and leading laypeople, with the power to excommunicate those who refused to change their ways. However, Basel's city council, which already had a lot of control over moral issues, was wary of giving too much power to the church. Instead, they created two institutions: an Ehegericht to handle marriage disputes and parish morals councils to issue warnings that could lead to excommunication, though the final decision remained with the city council. In the rural areas around the Abbey of St. Gall, where Anabaptist groups were strong, local clerics also pushed for an autonomous system of church discipline. Zwingli, however, argued against this at synods in Rheineck and the Thurgau in 1529, advocating for a system where church officials would warn sinners, but secular authorities would enforce the punishment. While the Reformation spread in some parts of Switzerland, it faced strong opposition in others. The forest cantons of Uri, Schweiz, Unterwalden, and Zug had a long history of distrust towards Zurich, dating back to wars fought in the 15th century. These cantons were also less influenced by anti-clerical sentiments, because they had no monasteries. The rural communities here were deeply attached to Catholic rituals that promised protection against nature's unpredictability. When Zurich invited the people of Obwalden to participate in the Second Zurich Disputation, they responded with a letter that reflected their loyalty to Rome and suspicion of Zwingli's reforms. They stated that they would maintain their traditional beliefs and practices as determined by the Pope and the Church, and would not alter them without a command from a Pope or a Church Council. Lucerne, a city dependent on military business, also opposed the Reformation. Early evangelicals who criticized mercenary service were expelled in 1522, and Zwingli's portrait was burned in the streets during the Carnival of 1523. By 1524, Lucerne, Drug, Guri, Schwitze, and Unterwalden were coordinating to combat heresy, and tough measures were taken to suppress the evangelical cause within their boundaries. Fribourg, in 1527, became the first polity in Europe to require its inhabitants to swear loyalty to the Roman Church. Solothurn, though initially supportive of the Reformation, ultimately remained loyal to Rome. The Berner Oberland also resisted the abolition of the Mass, leading to violent but ultimately unsuccessful resistance. Despite these challenges, Zwingli worked to form a confessional alliance to defend the evangelical cause. He was not a pacifist, and believed that Christian magistrates had a duty to use force to protect the proclamation of God's truth. In 1527, Zwingli helped establish the Christian Fortress Alliance, which included cities like Constance, Bern, St. Gall, Basel, Schaffhausen, Biel-Mulhouse, and Strasbourg. The Catholic cantons responded by forming their own Christian union with Austria. The alliance between Swiss and South German evangelicals was strong, though each city had its own approach to reform. Constance and Strasbourg, for example, had their own theologians and implemented reforms that reflected their unique contexts. Strasbourg removed church images in 1524, and its new liturgy in 1525 simplified the Eucharist and eliminated most holidays. Constance's reforms, adopted between 1527 and 1531, stripped churches of decoration and established a system of civic discipline, though they retained some holy days. When the Eucharistic controversy erupted, leading theologians from Strasbourg and Constance generally supported the Swiss position, but were cautious about letting the issue divide the evangelical movement. Martin Bucer of Strasbourg worked to mediate between the two sides, while Johann Blauer of Constance argued that the interpretation of the Eucharist was a minor issue. In 1530, the first formal confessions of faith were drafted for the emperor at the Diet of Augsburg. Most evangelical territories aligned with the Augsburg Confession, drafted by Philip Melanchthon. Zwingli, however, drafted his own account of his faith, and cities like Strasbourg, Memmingen, Lindau, and Constance submitted the Tetrapolitan Confession, which differed from the Augsburg Confession by rejecting the use of images and emphatical teaching. In cities like Augsburg, Ulm, and Frankfurt, where reforming impulses from Zurich and Strasbourg competed with those from Wittenberg, the Zwinglian preachers often gained more support. In Augsburg, the Zwinglians became the dominant evangelical party, supported by the guilds and some ruling elite. The city fathers eventually expelled the Lutherans, who were the weaker party. The Zwinglians called for the removal of all graven images and a stricter moral code, which resonated more with the people than the Lutheran approach. The greater appeal of Zwinglian ideas in these cities can be attributed to their sharper and more psychologically satisfying break from late medieval religiosity. The Zwinglian call to eliminate all images and the symbolic understanding of the Eucharist offered a clear and compelling alternative to the practices that had come under criticism. The Zwinglian emphasis on moral purification also aligned with the early evangelical hopes for social renewal, making their message more compelling to those seeking a gooding change in their communities. This dynamic played out similarly in other cities, where the Reformed positions often gained more traction than the Lutheran ones. The sterner and more thorough reforms of the Zwinglians addressed the deep-seated concerns of people who were disillusioned with the practices of the Catholic Church and sought a more authentic and biblically grounded faith. The events of 1530 to 31 marked a turning point in the Reformation. Before this, the ideas of Huldrych Zwingli, a Swiss reformer, were spreading in parts of Germany and Switzerland. However, these ideas faced strong opposition from Martin Luther and his followers, who dominated the northern regions of Germany. Despite this, the Reformed ideas, which emphasized more symbolic understanding of the Eucharist, communion, had gained a foothold in several key areas by 1530. In the north of Germany, cities like Augsburg and Ulm were rare places where different evangelical preachers could openly debate their ideas. Zwingli's writings, however, did not gain much traction in this region. Only one of his books was translated into Low German, the local language. Despite this, some preachers in the region between Goslar and the North German coast independently developed views on the Eucharist that were similar to Zwingli's. These views were often condemned by local Lutherans as sacramentarian meaning. They believed the bread and wine in communion were symbols, rather than the actual body and blood of Christ. In Silesia, a region in the east, Two men named Caspar Schwenkfeld and Valentine Krotwald developed a theology that emphasized Christ's spiritual presence in communion, not a physical one. They reached out to Zwingli, seeing him as a kindred spirit. However, when Lutheran theologians in Wittenberg heard about these ideas, they quickly warned local authorities, often leading to the expulsion of these preachers. In Goslar, for example, Luther's associate, Nicholas von Amsdorf, was sent to debate and eventually banish two popular preachers who held these views. Catholic leaders also found these ideas offensive. In Silesia, a royal decree in 1528 threatened death to anyone who supported the new heresy against the real presence of Christ in communion. Duke Friedrich of Liegnitz, who had initially protected Schwenkfeld, was forced to expel him to avoid losing his lands. Even in Wismar and Emden, where Reformed ideas initially gained traction, pressure eventually led to a more Lutheran direction. Despite these challenges, by 1530, Reformed ideas had taken root in significant parts of the German-speaking world, especially in the South. Zwingli was actively building alliances to protect and spread Protestantism, while Luther insisted that resistance to the emperor was never justified. Zwingli's efforts to form alliances with princes like Philip of Hesse showed promise, but the political landscape changed dramatically in 1530–31. First, the formation of the Schmalkaldic League, a defensive alliance of Protestant princes, was conditioned on members adhering to either the Augsburg or Tetrapolitan confessions. The Swiss, who did not accept these confessions, were excluded. This strengthened Lutheran influence within the empire. Second, Luther's stance on resistance to the emperor shifted. In 1530, legal advisors convinced him that territorial princes had the right to resist unjust imperial laws. This opened the door for armed resistance if the emperor tried to enforce laws against religious innovation. Finally, in 1531, Zwingli's military strategy in Switzerland ended in disaster. The First Kappel War, which Zwingli had pushed for, resulted in a defeat for Zurich. Zwingli himself was killed in battle, and his body was quartered and burned. This defeat marked the end of Zwingli's influence and the retreat of Reformed ideas within Switzerland. The defeat at Kappel and the subsequent peace treaty required Zurich to renounce all foreign alliances. Catholicism was restored in several areas, and the rapid expansion of Reformed ideas came to a halt. Zurich's government took steps to prevent any single minister from gaining too much influence over foreign policy again. In the years following Zwingli's death, a new generation of Reformed leaders emerged. Heinrich Bullinger, a young theologian, took over Zwingli's position in Zurich. Bullinger worked to defend and expand Zwingli's legacy, overcoming the isolation that threatened the Zurich church. He became a prominent figure in a group of theologians who restated Zwingli's ideas in a way that reached a broader European audience. In East Friesland, a region in northwest Germany, John A. Lasko, a Polish aristocrat, established a center for Reformed propaganda. This region, isolated from the main centers of Lutheran influence, became a model for other Reformed churches. In Geneva, John Calvin, another refugee, transformed the city into a model of a godly Christian community and a center for the spread of Reformed ideas. These new leaders, including Bullinger, A. Lasko, and Calvin, enriched and codified the theological legacy of the first generation of Reformed thinkers. They oversaw the creation of new Reformed churches and established a network of contacts that spread Reformed ideas across Europe. While they sometimes disagreed on specific points, they managed to build effective working relationships and drew up confessional statements that expressed their shared beliefs. By the 1550s and 1560s, the Reformed tradition had expanded dramatically across Europe, thanks to the work of this second generation of leaders. They laid the groundwork for the continued growth and influence of Reformed churches, even in the face of opposition and challenges. Heinrich Bullinger was born in 1504 in the Aargau region, close to Zurich. At that time, the area was under the control of the Swiss Confederation, and evangelical worship was forbidden after the Second Capel War. Clerical concubinage, or priests having partners, was not just common but officially allowed by the bishop in Constance, who would overlook the practice for a fee. Bullinger was the youngest of 5 sons of a church dean and his partner. From a young age, Bullinger was destined for a life in the clergy, and at 12 he left home to study at a prestigious humanist school in Emmerich, in the Duchy of Cleves. Bullinger's education took him to the University of Cologne in 1519, right when the controversy over Martin Luther's teachings was at its peak. Curious and determined to form his own opinions, Bullinger began a deep study of theology. He read Peter Lombard's Sentences, a standard medieval text, and compared it with the Bible and the writings of the early church fathers. He then delved into Luther's reformist works from 1520. Bullinger found that Luther's ideas were more aligned with the original Christian sources, and he began to reject the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. Philip Melanchthon's Commonplaces, which he discovered in 1521, further solidified his new beliefs. In 1522, Bullinger returned home to Bremgarten, now a young man who had rejected his earlier plans to join the Carthusian order. He accepted a position as head of the cloister school at Kappel, but negotiated special terms to avoid taking monastic vows or attending Mass. At Kappel, he started a Bible study group that was open to all, similar to the Zurich Provisai, where ministers and laypeople discussed Scripture. This group attracted the attention of Huldrych Zwingli and others in Zurich, and Bullinger soon became part of their circle. By 1524, Bullinger felt close enough to Zwingli to share his ideas about the Eucharist, which he believed should be understood symbolically. In 1527, he spent time in Zurich improving his knowledge of ancient languages and attending the Proceae. His skills and dedication impressed the Zurich authorities, and in 1528 he became a parish minister in Kappel after the cloister was secularized. In 1529, Bullinger's father, who had been a priest in Bremgarten, announced to his congregation that he had been teaching false doctrines and had now seen the light. This caused a stir, and the congregation, still largely loyal to the old ways, decided to remove him. Bullinger was invited to preach a trial sermon, and his powerful message led the congregation to remove the church's images and burn them. Impressed, they offered him the position as their new minister. However, Bullinger's success was short-lived. In 1531, after the Second Capel War, evangelical worship was banned in the Aargau. Despite this, Bullinger's reputation was such that several cities, including Zurich, Basel, Bern, and Appenzell, offered him positions. Zurich, in particular, wanted him to succeed Zwingli as the pastor of the Great Minster. However, the city's authorities, wary of the political influence of ministers, required that preachers avoid discussing political matters. Bullinger refused to accept this condition, arguing that a pastor's duty included speaking out on moral and political issues. The city eventually agreed to allow ministers to submit their criticisms in writing, and Bullinger took the position. At just 27, Bullinger became the leader of Zurich's church and the Entiste, responsible for overseeing other ministers and communicating with the city government. He defended the church organization and discipline established by Zwingli, arguing against the idea of a purely ecclesiastical court for moral offenses. Instead, he believed that Christian magistrates should oversee both religious and civil matters, drawing on the model of ancient Israel. Bullinger also worked to maintain the church's influence in civic affairs. He helped draft an ordinance in 1532 that created a joint committee of magistrates and ministers to oversee the church's activities. This committee had the authority to appoint new ministers and determine their fitness. Bullinger and his fellow ministers also fought to keep the Great Minster autonomous and to prevent the misuse of church property for non-religious purposes. Throughout the 1530s and 1540s, Bullinger faced challenges from within and outside Zurich. The Protestant movement was divided, and efforts to reconcile the different factions were ongoing. Martin Luther, in particular, remained hostile to the Swiss reformers, and attempts to find common ground, such as the Wittenberg Concord, were met with suspicion by Bullinger and the Zurich Church. Despite this, Bullinger maintained a steady correspondence with other reformers, defending his views on the Eucharist and other issues. In 1549, Bullinger met with John Calvin in Zurich to negotiate a joint statement on the Eucharist, the Consensus Tigurinus. This agreement stated that Christ was truly present in the Eucharist, but it distinguished between the physical and spiritual aspects of the sacrament. This compromise helped to bring the churches of Zurich and Geneva closer together, and it was accepted by Bern as well. The Consensus Tigurinus was a significant step in the development of the Reformed churches, helping to solidify the alliance between the key Swiss cities and define a Eucharistic position that allowed for a range of interpretation. Bullinger's leadership and diplomacy played a crucial role in navigating the complex political and theological landscape of the Reformation. His efforts helped to preserve the Zwinglian legacy and strengthen the Reformed movement in Switzerland and beyond. Bullinger, a key figure in the Swiss Reformation, played a crucial role in shaping the beliefs and practices of the Protestant churches in Switzerland and beyond. One of his most significant contributions was the drafting of the Second Helvetic Confession in 1566. This document was originally a personal statement of faith that Bullinger wrote in 1561, intending it to be read by the Zurich City Council after his death. However, when political tensions flared up in 1566 due to the Elector Palatine introducing reformed elements into his church, Bullinger saw an opportunity to use his statement to support the elector. He shared it with other Protestant leaders, and it quickly gained the support of ministers from cities like Zurich, Bern, and Geneva. Over the next decade, the Second Helvetic Confession was endorsed by Reformed churches in France, Scotland, and Hungary, solidifying its importance as a foundational text for the Reformed tradition. Bullinger's work extended far beyond this single document. He was a prolific writer and theologian, producing numerous treatises and commentaries that had a profound impact on the Reformed movement. One of his earliest works, On the Origin of Errors, written in 1528, explored how the early Christian church gradually adopted practices that led to its corruption. This work emphasized the dangers of ritual innovations and reinforced the Reformed suspicion of any changes to established worship practices. Bullinger's writings often built upon the ideas of his mentor Huldrych Zwingli, but he developed his own distinct voice and terminology. After moving to Zurich, Bullinger began a series of Latin commentaries on the New Testament. These commentaries, which started in 1533, were the first systematic project of their kind by a Reformed theologian. In these works, Bullinger stressed the importance of true believers not hiding their faith or participating in Catholic rituals. For example, he warned against taking communion in the Roman Catholic Church, arguing that it was a form of idolatry. He also advised those living in areas where the true faith was persecuted to teach their children at home and to publicly profess their faith whenever possible. One of Bullinger's most influential works was a collection of 50 sermons known as the Decades. Published between 1549 and 1551, these sermons were initially intended for the edification of clergy and for use in church services. However, they quickly became popular among lay people as well, earning the nickname Housebook in German and Dutch. The Decades covered a wide range of topics, from the nature of God's Word and the doctrine of justification by faith to the Ten Commandments and the nature of the Church. The book was so well received that it was recommended by Reformed church synods for use by ministers and lay groups in small communities. Bullinger's writings were widely disseminated and translated into multiple languages. The Decades went through 32 editions, and his Sum of the Christian Religion was printed 30 times by 1670. His On the Origin of Errors was reprinted 17 times by 1621. In total, over 400 editions of his works were published, far surpassing the number of editions of Zwingli's writings. His books were particularly popular in England, France, and the Netherlands, where the house book became a staple in pious households and was even used on ships of the Dutch East India Company. While Bullinger's theology largely followed Zwingli's, he introduced some new ideas in terminology. For example, he used the metaphor of a covenant to emphasize the reliability of God's promises and the importance of making a pact to serve God. This idea of a covenant, which was deeply rooted in the political culture of Switzerland, would be further developed by later Reformed theologians. Bullinger also believed in the predestination of the elect, but was hesitant to affirm the idea of double predestination, which holds that God predestines both the saved and the damned. This stance led to a debate with Calvin, whom Bullinger privately admonished for delving too deeply into God's mysteries. Zurich, under Bullinger's leadership, continued to be a center for Reformed ideas. The city's school for training ministers attracted prominent scholars, including Conrad Pelikan, who wrote an 8-volume set of commentaries on the Bible, and Theodor Bibliander, who prepared one of the first Latin translations of the Quran. Rudolf Walther, Bullinger's student, served as a pastor in Zurich for many years before succeeding Bullinger as Antes. Another notable figure was Peter Martyr Vermigli, a Florentine theologian who fled Italy due to his evangelical beliefs. Vermigli taught at the Zurich School and wrote commentaries on the Old Testament that were later compiled into a systematic exposition of doctrine known as the Commonplaces. Vermigli's work, which was published in 1576, became a standard text for theological instruction and was praised by leading scholars like Justus Julius Scaliger. Bern, another Swiss city, also became a stronghold of the Reformed tradition. Wolfgang Musculus, a strict and influential theologian, taught at Bern's municipal secondary school from 1549 to 1560. Musculus's major work, The Commonplaces of the Christian Religion, was a systematic exposition of Reformed doctrine that emphasized the importance of magisterial control over the Church. He argued that Christian magistrates had the duty to preserve God's honor and promote piety, and he saw the Church as an administrative agency of the state. Musculus's ideas on church-state relations would influence later theories of state control over the Church within the Reformed tradition. Bullinger's extensive correspondence further extended the reach of his ideas. He wrote over 15,000 letters, more than any other Protestant reformer of his time. His letters were not only a means of communication, but also a way to advise and support fellow reformers across Europe. Bullinger's correspondence included leaders from cities like Bern, Basel, and Geneva, as well as from England, Poland, Hungary, France, and Italy. His letters were often copied and shared, spreading his ideas far and wide. Through his writings and correspondence, Bullinger played a crucial role in shaping the Reformed movement and ensuring it spread beyond Switzerland. His work laid the foundation for the development of Reformed theology and practice, influencing generations of theologians and believers. The vast amount of correspondence left by Heinrich Bullinger, the Zurich Antist, has made it a challenge for scholars to fully study and understand its significance. A team of researchers began publishing his letters in 1973, but the sheer volume means they won't finish until 2109. Despite this, the letters that have been studied offer a glimpse into Bullinger's role as a key figure in the Protestant Reformation. Bullinger exchanged over 1,500 letters with people in the Grisons, a region to the southeast of the Swiss Confederacy. This area was largely autonomous and continued to advance evangelical ideas, even after the Second Peace of Kappel. Through his letters, Bullinger shared his writings, suggested candidates for church positions, offered advice on political and religious matters, and kept his correspondents informed about the latest developments in Europe. The southern towns of the Grisons, like Chiavenna, became home to many Italian evangelical refugees who brought new and often radical ideas. Bullinger corresponded with these refugees, addressing their questions and concerns. For example, when Camilla Renato proposed a unique interpretation of the Lord's Supper and rejected Catholic baptism, Bullinger wrote to defend Zurich's views and helped resolve a potential schism among the Italian refugees. Bullinger's influence extended far beyond the Grisons. He and Martin Bucer organized a letter-writing campaign in 1536 to support Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Bullinger also met with English merchants who visited Zurich, and these interactions led to ongoing contacts between Zurich and the English Protestants. Many of Queen Elizabeth's first bishops had connections to Zurich and maintained regular communication with Bullinger, seeking advice on church matters. Hungarian evangelicals began visiting Zurich in 1543, seeking Bullinger's guidance on issues like confession, church goods, and the use of images in worship. In 1551, Bullinger wrote a long open letter to the faithful in Hungary, outlining Reformed doctrine and criticizing Roman Catholic practices. This letter was widely circulated and eventually printed twice in 1559. Bullinger's son-in-law, Ludwig Lavater, also wrote a book on the rites and institutions of the Zurich Church, which helped spread Zurich's practices to other regions. Polish reformers also reached out to Bullinger from 1549 onward. He exchanged letters with over 20 Poles and became involved in disputes over the doctrine of the Trinity, even publishing 2 works on the subject. Through his letters and books, Bullinger's ideas reached far and wide, influencing the Reformation in many parts of Europe. While Reformed ideas spread to places like England and Poland, they faced significant challenges within the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther's strong opposition to sacramentarian views, the Schmalkaldic League's requirement that members reject these views, and the outcomes of the Schmalkaldic Wars all contributed to the decline of Reformed currents in the empire. The Augsburg Interim, imposed by Charles V after his victory in 1547 and the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which granted legal toleration only to those accepting the Augsburg Confession, further marginalized Reformed ideas. Despite these setbacks, Reformed ideas persisted in some areas. East Friesland, a small territory, isolated by marshes and dunes, maintained a Reformed orientation. The city of Emden, in particular, resisted Lutheran influences and welcomed John A. Lasko, a prominent Reformed leader, as superintendent of the church in 1542. John A. Lasko's journey to becoming a Reformed leader is a testament to the enduring appeal of Reformed ideas. Born into a noble Polish family in 1499, A. Lasko received a prestigious education in Bologna, Padua, and Paris. He met Zwingli in Zurich and Erasmus in Basel, where he attended Oecolampadius's lectures. Initially, Lasko agreed with Erasmus's more moderate views on the Eucharist, but his experiences and studies eventually led him to embrace Reformed theology. His role in East Friesland and his correspondence with Bullinger highlight the continued spread of Reformed ideas even in the face of significant opposition. The story of Heinrich Bullinger and John A. Lasko shows how the Reformation was not just a series of battles and political maneuvers, but but also a network of personal connections and correspondence that shaped the religious landscape of Europe. Despite the challenges, Reformed ideas found ways to survive and thrive, influencing the course of history in profound ways. John A. Lasko, a Polish nobleman, found himself at a crossroads after returning to Poland. His family made a risky political move by supporting John Zapoliai's claim to the Hungarian throne after the Battle of Mohacs in 1528. This decision backfired when King Sigismund backed Ferdinand of Habsburg, who took control of most of Hungary. As a result, Lasko lost a promised bishopric in Hungary and fell out of favor in Poland. His hopes for a high ecclesiastical position began to fade. Feeling disillusioned, Lasko started writing to Philip Melanchthon, a leading Protestant reformer. He remembered the lively and pious conversations he had with evangelical scholars in the West and decided to visit them. During one of his trips in 1539 to 1540, he met a group in Louvain influenced by the Brethren of the Common Life. Among them was Albert Hardenberg, a Franciscan who later became an evangelical preacher in Bremen, and a weaver's daughter whom Lasko decided to marry. This marriage marked his break with the Catholic Church, and he fled to East Friesland, a safe haven for religious dissidents. In East Friesland, Lasko embraced a position on the Eucharist similar to that of Heinrich Bullinger. After living in Emden for 2 years, he became the superintendent of the territorial church, a role similar to a bishop. As a Protestant leader, Lasko focused more on practical reforms and personal piety than on complex theology. He rejected strict confessions of faith, a stance that would later be echoed by the Dutch Remonstrants. Lasko's strength lay in organizing the church. He convinced Countess Anna to remove all altars and images from the churches in her territory and established a system of church discipline. This system, run by a joint board of ministers and lay elders, had the power to exclude people from communion for misbehavior or false beliefs. He also created a weekly meeting called the Coitus, where clergymen discussed doctrine, reviewed each other's behavior, and examined candidates for the ministry. This helped maintain uniformity in church practices and doctrine, especially in an area with strong Anabaptist influences and many Lutheran church leaders. Lasko wrote and debated against the Anabaptists, prepared a catechism, and encouraged the countess to enforce strict laws requiring church attendance and punishing blasphemy and usury. However, in 1548, the military victory of Charles V over the Schmalkaldic League threatened East Friesland. To avoid Habsburg intervention, Countess Anna accepted a modified version of the Augsburg Interim. Lasko, rejecting the compromises with Catholic practices, moved to London. In London, Edward VI invited Lasko to lead the churches for French and Dutch refugees. Lasko helped shape the order of worship and institutions of these churches, which became the basis for his most important work, the full form and manner of the ecclesiastical ministry established in the Strangers' Church of London. This book, published in Latin in 1555 and translated into French and Dutch, detailed the structure and practices of a properly reformed church. The refugee churches in London followed a model similar to those in Strasbourg and Geneva, with ministerial offices of divine institution, pastors, elders, and deacons, and autonomous church discipline. However, Lasko's model placed even greater emphasis on church discipline, identifying it as a core aspect of a true church. He also included the office of civil magistrate as a divinely founded role, responsible for upholding the law and maintaining church order. The book allowed for congregational participation in selecting ministers and included detailed descriptions of rituals, sacraments, and prayers. The refugee churches in East Friesland and London became centers for the spread of Reformed ideas. Emden, in particular, became a haven for refugees from the Low Countries, many of whom were Anabaptists. The city's printing presses produced numerous Protestant books, including Bibles, devotional works, and theological treatises, which were often intended for export to the Low Countries. The church in Emden provided advice and ministers to evangelical communities in the Low Countries, earning it the title of Mother Church of the Reformed movement in the northern Netherlands. Meanwhile, other refugee centers emerged in England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Switzerland. Cities like Wesel, Aachen, and Frankfurt, as well as Strasbourg and Geneva, provided havens for refugees and incubated models of church organization that would later influence the Reformed movement's expansion. During this period, Philip Melanchthon, a leading Wittenberg reformer, also played a significant role. Melanchthon's theology evolved, and he granted the will a role in justification and adopted a more spiritual interpretation of the real presence in the Eucharist. He modified the Augsburg Confession in 1540 to remove the suggestion of Christ's physical presence in the elements, making it more acceptable to those who held a spiritual view. This change allowed future rulers who favored Reformed doctrines to claim the right to institute such worship under the terms of the Peace of Augsburg. These developments in the 1540s and 1550s laid the groundwork for the Reformed tradition's renewed advance in Germany and the Low Countries, shaping the future of Protestantism in Europe. John Calvin, a young Frenchman with a sharp mind and a deep faith, arrived in Geneva in 1536. He didn't plan to stay long, but a fiery preacher named Guillaume Farel had other ideas. Farel, who had been working tirelessly to spread the Protestant faith in the region, saw in Calvin a valuable ally. He convinced Calvin to stay with a powerful warning. God would curse Calvin's desire for a quiet life of study if he didn't help the struggling church in Geneva. Calvin, moved by this divine call, decided to stay and devote himself to the work of reform. Geneva, a city of about 10,000 people, had recently broken free from the control of the Dukes of Savoy and the bishop. It was a place of new beginnings, where the spirit of independence and reform was strong. The city had already taken steps to embrace the Protestant faith, thanks to the efforts of Farel and others. They had abolished the Mass, stripped the churches of idols, and established a simpler, more Bible-centered worship. But the city was still a place of turmoil. With many challenges ahead, Calvin's arrival marked a turning point. He brought with him a brilliant mind and a deep understanding of the Bible, which he had explored in his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This book, which explained the core beliefs of the Protestant faith, quickly gained a wide audience and earned Calvin a reputation as a leading theologian. In Geneva, Calvin worked to build a church that was not only spiritually strong, but also disciplined and organized. One of Calvin's most significant contributions was the establishment of a system of church discipline. This meant that the church would actively work to ensure that its members lived according to Christian principles. Those who broke the rules faced consequences, from public rebukes to banishment. This system, while strict, helped create a sense of order and moral integrity in the city. Geneva became a magnet for Protestants from all over Europe, who were drawn by its reputation as a place of religious freedom and reform. Calvin also played a crucial role in the education of the next generation of Protestant leaders. He founded a theological academy that attracted students from far and wide. The academy became a center of learning and a launching pad for the spread of Reformed ideas. Calvin's influence extended beyond Geneva through his extensive correspondence and his involvement in international controversies. He often took the lead in defending Reformed beliefs and advising other Protestant communities, particularly the refugee churches scattered across Europe. Despite his success, Calvin faced many challenges. The city of Geneva was a complex place, with political tensions and resistance to his reforms. Calvin had to navigate these challenges with wisdom and perseverance. He worked closely with the city's leaders to implement his vision, but he also faced opposition from those who resisted his strict moral code and his ideas about church governance. Calvin's influence extended far beyond Geneva. His teachings and the model of church he established in Geneva inspired the growth of Reformed churches in Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and even England. The Reformed tradition, with its emphasis on the sovereignty of God, the authority of Scripture, and the need for a disciplined Christian life, became a powerful force in the Protestant world. In the end, John Calvin's legacy is one of profound impact. He helped shape the Reformed tradition, which continues to influence millions of Christians around the world. His work in Geneva, his writings, and his leadership all contributed to the spread of the Protestant faith and the establishment of a new model of church and society. Calvin's story is a testament to the power of faith, intellect, and dedication in the face of great challenges.